Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I am Nicholas Kanoki from the Asset Leadership Network, and I am excited for this presentation on what we just had, the microgrid workshop focusing on Ukraine. And before we get underway, I just want to say, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat so that we can improve our process and get you some answers. As you see, we have an esteemed panel of experts in a variety of fields. Kimon Onuma, John Arnott just signed off. He was part of the workshop. Mark Giuliani, William Heegaard, Art Kurland, and Michael Hardy. And this, I think we're going to start with Kimon doing a bit of where we're at, and then move on to other panelists as the event unfolds. Before we start, we just want to thank today's sponsors of the event: Onuma System with Kimon Onuma, Trent Port Services with John Arnott, who was just participating, and Grant Thornton. And then we also want to thank our patron members here at the ALN. They support things that we do, make it possible for events like this, as well as our newsletter and other things. And our other organizational members are extremely important to everything we do here. As a network, we rely on collaborating with other organizations and leaders. So thank you for your continued support and participation. And I think Mike Bordenero, Executive Director of the ALN, is going to talk a little about where we're at and maybe talk about tomorrow's event as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Nick. And yes, Nick's right. We've been having this summit focused on microgrids, and the sub idea is microgrids in Ukraine. We had focused on microgrids because Dorothy Robine was interested in that. She's an esteemed federal executive, and we wanted to show how a structured approach to asset management can benefit microgrids. It's an emerging industry sector, and it would be good to have that structured approach overlaid on it as it grows. We had a roundtable yesterday, and today we are having a workshop showing how to do microgrid asset management. And it's based in reality because Dorothy Robine had sent a copy of the Microgrid Knowledge newsletter, and on the cover was footprint projects sending microgrids to Ukraine for use in a hospital. So we reached out, and Will Heegaard said he'd be willing to participate in this type of workshop, and he's been collaborating with Kimon. And then we had a very fortuitous joining of the ALN by Trent Port Services, and John Arnott, who was in the roundtable yesterday and contributed to the workshop today, has taught us that ports are microgrids in and of themselves, because when cargo containers are lowered, that's generating friction and energy, and that energy either has to be used for other uses or burnt off. So it's best to establish a microgrid to enable that to focus back into the grid. So Kimon Onuma, patron of the ALN, has been running BIMStorm since 2007 on the public level. He's been working online using building information models to inspire brainstorms for a couple of decades. And he has done BIMStorms with us in the past, including at University Health, where Art Kurland is. And now we're focusing on microgrids and with the subtext of Ukraine. So Kimon.
Yes.
How you doing? We just did
Good.
2 hours of workshop. That's kind of exhausting.
No, it's good. We had a lot of good interaction. So we're going to condense it now to an hour or less, right?
Yes.
So can I share my screen?
Yes.
let's see. It's okay. Now it's letting me. Okay. All right. So just a introduction to what this was about. This is the BIMStorm for Microgrid. This is a BIMStorm website, BIMStorm.com. But along the top, you see the different ones that are happening right now. In a couple of weeks, we're with the Los Angeles Community Colleges at a conference, but we're focusing today on microgrids. There's a microgrid tab. You can follow along here. We're going to be posting more information as it happens. And then there's another button here for drilling into more detail. And the scenarios really were about looking at a microgrid anywhere in the world, really, but really focused in on Ukraine. And then we also have participation from ART in San Antonio, and then we have the LA City Colleges, and we have 2 locations. We have Kharkiv and Odessa. But jumping back a little bit, maybe we set the stage first with the assets that we were looking at. So and we're talking about digital twins. We want to reinforce that. There's a lot of buzz out there about digital twins. We've been doing that since the early 90s or so. So it didn't used to be called digital twins back then, but essentially it's a way to organize information that makes it accessible in a virtual environment, but linked to the real world as well too. So the first thing that we did with the microgrid exercise was to get a list, and this is a digital, to us, a list in Excel or a table like this is a digital twin, because we want to get a list of assets, their sizes, and their performance characteristics. For example, if we have a solar array, how many kilowatt hours is it, and how many kilowatts is it, and what other characteristics, and how do you get to it, how do you deliver it, how do you deploy it, all that. So we collected all that for the last few weeks from the different participants, and one of them was Will from, and I'll open up your slides, Project Footprint. Will, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet because I know we're condensing, but just as a brief background on Footprint Project, we're a small nonprofit that deploys mobile solar generators and microgrids to disasters, most in to manage a network of 50 mobile solar generators, but we did get involved in Ukraine right after the conflict broke out to deploy some portable systems, and then we have sailors in Moldova right now. So we manage a kind of a community-owned fleet of equipment ranging from portable solar generators up to larger trailers like that photo you see here. And during the last few weeks and then hours, we've been kind of collaborating to model what it would look like to deploy a containerized solar microgrid with a number of portable solar generators to the Kharkiv Regional Hospital, and then deploy them to set them up to power specific exam rooms. So we have already shipped and have distributed LED surgical headlamps to these field hospitals. Those are already in Ukraine right now, and then we're looking at how to get more equipment in the larger portable to containerized scale to recharge not only those headlamps, but also a number of any other electrical loads that the hospitals might need in those facilities. So those photos that Kimon is kind of searching through or clicking through are from various deployments that we've done. That photo specifically was in Houma, Louisiana, after Hurricane Ida, where we set up a palletized microgrid to power a volunteer base camp. That kind of photo, I think, shows a lot of what could be done in Ukraine outside of field of physical infrastructure or traditional infrastructure while they're rebuilding their permanent infrastructure. This solar trailer we built in Puerto Rico with outside of a fire station, and it's now set up as a mobile solar microgrid to deploy to regional outages in Puerto Rico with the fire department there. So a lot of this technology, I mean, it's kind of relatively off the shelf in the sense that you have a lithium battery and then an inverter, solar panels, and charge controller equipment. But as you go from, suitcase-sized systems that can power an LED light, a cell phone, and a laptop and Wi-Fi up to infrastructure scale power systems, like multiple Tesla Powerwalls, or a large mobile microgrid with a backup diesel genset. Those systems get really complicated and can require a lot of planning to deploy effectively for various kind of larger scale power needs. So with that, I mean, we're here to kind of share what we've done so far, try to and explore ways to collaborate in the future. I mean, a lot of this digital twin stuff could be replicated pretty quickly in Ukraine with our existing partnerships. It just really comes down to resources and logistics.
Great. Thanks, Will.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll jump into the exercise with you, then we'll talk a little bit more about the gen sets and Trent. But so what's interesting from a digital twin perspective is that as you set up, it's really about collecting knowledge from all these different participants. It's not just the technology, right? That's why you see a lot of people on this call. There's a lot of knowledge about how to put these systems together. Some of it is digital, some of it's in our heads, and some of it we have to collaborate to make decisions on. And that's what this exercise really is about. If we focus in on Kharkiv, we have this part of Ukraine where there's a lot going on there. There's a need for facilities. There's infrastructure that might be going down, and we're focusing in on a specific asset here, the regional hospital there. So this is the regional hospital in Kharkiv. This is actually a web application, our application, but we're also connecting to a lot of other digital twin tools and databases. So BIM and Revit and databases that we've created in other databases, and then maps. These maps are coming from Google Earth. There's a lot of other sources as well too. The great thing about this is we don't have to build a mapping application, and these maps are getting more and more accurate, so you could zoom in and actually see a parking lot with cars. But in this scenario that we looked at here, we found the hospital, and we know very little about the building. All we know is from the satellite data and the shape of it. And the scenario we're setting up is that there's an annex here, an 8-story annex that the power went down, and that annex has critical spaces inside it, which we'll talk about next, like exam rooms that are not getting power, and the doctors there cannot do their work. And we want to run through how do we power the exam room. And so we had the units that Will was talking about parked out here as a delivery before we actually set up the scenarios. Okay, here are the assets that are available. They're in transit. They're partially delivered. Now we want to look at the scenario of the hospital. In the hospital itself, we will show you the inside of it next, but we know that there are 8 exam rooms, and there's a mechanical unit that powers part of it as well too. So with Will's assets, and maybe you could explain this a little bit, it's kind of interesting because there are those mobile power packs, which are essentially battery units that you can move into a specific room. So microgrid doesn't necessarily have to be the whole building. It could be very targeted to individual pieces of equipment in the exam rooms, and you can move them in. So you could do it in phases, which I learned as well too as we would talk to you guys. So describe that process. Maybe we'll walk through a mini exercise here.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in many of our deployments, we kind of think about the systems that we deploy in buckets of, over the timeline. And so in this kind of scenario, we'd look at getting a number of handheld or portable power packs. So those are, battery packs that are like the size of a suitcase up to a duffel bag or a checked luggage, and getting those deployed and delivered into the exam rooms as kind of plug-in-able, energy access points that have enough, kilowatt hours of energy storage to power those exam rooms for about 8 to 12 hours. And so we'd get those in as kind of our first in batch of energy access units or solar generators. And those systems could be then recharged by the containerized microgrid that we'd be setting up in the hospital parking lot while the exam rooms are getting kind of up. So we get the portable systems into each exam room, which allows the medical practitioners to continue their work while we're setting up dropping off a shipping container sized unit and setting up a 20 kilowatt solar array, which would be about 2,000 square feet of space. So we drop off the container and then start assembling or racking the solar panels in the parking lot. And that container system that we're modeling here could easily power up to 10 exam rooms for kind of indefinitely, as long as the sun comes out. It has a backup integrated diesel generator to kick on when the batteries get low. So you have the solar array that's feeding electricity into the battery system, and then all in that container. It can be considered kind of like a hybridized microgrid. So that container then can either recharge the portable batteries in the exam rooms, or if the local electrician can figure out how to get the load panel configured, you could wire it right into the load panel and power either a number of, the critical loads, the little red plugs. If you've ever been in a hospital, you'll see those red outlets. Those are the critical outlets that the backup generators power, or based on the size of the annex, you could power kind of orange loads in the triage level, so the less critical stuff. That's kind of, at the up to that containerized level is kind of as big as we go, and we're really to power that whole annex, you'd probably need a number of containerized solar microgrids, or bringing in larger megawatt scale diesel or alternative energy generators that could power the whole building independently.
Yeah, that's great. So what we talked about in the workshop is we have these containers, these 40-foot containers. We have to find a way to get them on the site. Then we have to find a place to park them that is relatively near the power source. The mechanical room. And we know from the next exercise, which we're going to show you a little more detail of, that in the layout of this building, we know that there's a mechanical room on this west side here. So parking this near here made sense because it's away from the main area. And we actually saw that we could park 2 containers here. And there was a space for the solar arrays here. We need to have south sun. This area looks like it has south sun. There's some shadow going on here, but you could do an additional analysis of what's the optimal place to put these arrays. And obviously these can be adjusted on site too, based on what they see, right? And then there's another scenario that we also have containerized units or even tent structures. We saw your tent structure there that can be a temporary structure with solar panels on it as well. So there's a lot of flexibility all the way from immediate deployment of the power packs to the containerized units to the arrays. And the next set that we're going to be talking about, the larger units as well. So that's the exercise that we did based on having this plan and having basic information about the facility. And this is, as an architect, I know that a lot of facility owners constantly struggle with this, even having accurate floor plans of their buildings. But in this scenario, we had zero information, but we were able to find out through conversations of what's inside this clinic that went down. And because we are architects and we understand how buildings and facilities go together, we were able to quickly create a layout that came pretty close to what we think they have there. And Mark, do you want to jump in and explain how that magic happened?
Before Mark gets started, I am remiss in that I didn't address something at the very beginning. It's something that Marty Rowland made a comment on. What we're doing is what we can because we're not war fighters. We know that Ukraine right now is in dire need of defending its country. But we want to show support. So we're showing what can happen for the reconstruction of Ukraine when the conflict ends. And it's not what is necessarily needed right now, but it's what we can do in our show of support. So I wanted to explain that. And what Mark did was make some assumptions based on his architectural experience on what could be an effective replacement clinic in Kharkiv or possibly any other place in Ukraine.
Thanks, Mike. So can everyone see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as Kimon said, I'm Mark Giuliani from Giuliani Associates Architects. And as Kimon said, here we are in Kharkiv. This is the site. And as we went through the site and gathered information, we basically, did a site survey and analyzed what was there and analyzed the equipment in each one of the spaces. And this just kind of goes through those three-dimensional spaces that we have from data sets that are available from medical facilities. And so what's important here is when you look at the exam rooms that we have this equipment. So the list of equipment's there, the assets are there, and what makes up those assets are there. So we can work with Will and determine the amount of power usage that's needed. And that allows us to know how much power is going to be needed, how to build a priority list so that if there's not enough power, we know what equipment to prioritize. And so as you go through these different facilities, these different spaces that make up the facility, you can start to see the different pieces of equipment. We look at the data sets, we can tell the power. This is the mechanical room. We know that it's on the east side of the building. And so we can start to see where are we going to bring in the power? Where are we going to start to park those trailers? And so the mechanical room's here. There's an open space over on this side. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. Let me grab something to write with. So over here is the open area where we can start to put the trailers that are holding the green ammonia systems, and then set up the panels for the solar collection, bring the power into this space here. And that helps us to set this place up and get it operational again as quickly as possible.
And by you documenting this, we actually can know in the exam rooms, there's some critical pieces of equipment. So as we phase in the power packs that we talked about earlier, we don't need to power the whole facility, but there's certain pieces of equipment that are critical. And
right.
so more of the larger units come in.
So working with the user groups, we would determine what are the most critical pieces of equipment. The red outlets, are usually the most critical. So we would work with Will's company to determine, well, how much power are we going to need, what power is available, and start to, take as many items from that priority list and power them up as quickly as possible.
Great. Okay, so we move on. Is it okay?
I think so.
Okay, great. So I'll switch to my screen. Mike, do you want to introduce what John is doing? I could show the slides. I could talk through it too, but maybe you'd be better to do the overall intro.
Yes, indeed. So John Arnup joined us from Singapore. He was up in the middle of the night for a couple hours with us and just had to crash. So that's totally understandable. John is CEO and founder of Trent Port Services, which provides asset management to ports around the world. And he informed us that ports are microgrids in and of themselves. They generate electricity when the cargo container is lowered. The resistance is like a turbine turning. So there is energy generated that either has to be used somewhere else or dissipated. And the idea of using it somewhere else is the microgrid concept. And he's familiar with the fact that there are many generators that are set up specifically for the operations of ports. They frequently power cranes individually, that there's a generator up on crane. And he has developed with a partner company a green ammonia generator, which the green ammonia is created through the energy generation through the cranes. And so it's quite sustainable. And for the scenario of requiring larger energy units for healthcare, John showed us his generator sets, and Kimon modeled them and brought them to the location for being able to power the healthcare models that Mark had created.
Yeah, exactly. So that these are the units from John's group right here, the ammonia 40-foot containers. So our scenario here is we got our first microgrid going with what Will was describing with the solar arrays. The larger units here can then power more of the building, additional parts of the building. So the concept here was, do we have space to park more here, or is this too tight, or do we need to move the arrays over, or do we need to park them on this other side? Then there was also the need to, since they're ammonia units and diesel generators, it's a mixture actually right now. We need a tank on a truck. Basically, a truck comes in, delivers refueling to those, and the truck needs to be parked away from the actual containers when it's not being used, but it needs to be nearby enough to be able to ferry power back, ammonia back and forth. And the scenario is we first started with this first floor of this annex, but it could be that the other floors need power as well too, or maybe the adjacent building has a change that needs to be, it's no longer operational and it gets damaged. So then it goes red and this building needs, so we need to bring in more units right here. But that's the beauty of these containers, is that it becomes very flexible. You don't have to wait a long time. And if there's a microgrid, it's self-contained in here. And you could run scenarios like this. And like we mentioned earlier, each one of these little blocks, they look like simple little blocks, but they are digital twins with data associated with them. If we start looking at the reports, it starts generating a report of how many kilowatt hours are being generated, how many are being used, what's the operational status, including if they're deployed on site. That's what the color coding is that you see. Each of these rows is an asset, and the color coding shows the condition of it, or if it's deployed, or if it's in transit, which is our next scenario, because these things are being moved from port or other sources, and as they make their way here, we want to be able to track that asset in real time. And the way that we do that is through these web services and open APIs that we're connecting to our system and other systems. And we even talked about with Will that there are sensors in some of these units, and if the sensors had a feed out of them, we could actually even open the sensor data and show it in a display, for example. Right now, we're just showing a display of the kilowatt hours of each of these, so we can keep track. It seems very simple, but when you start getting a lot of assets like this, you can't just have conversations every time to say, well, was that 1,000 or 2,000 kilowatts or megawatts or whatever, or what's the capacity of this, the tent structure? Well, how big is it? What about this array here? What's going on there? So that was the idea of collecting that list that I showed you earlier, which essentially is the beginning of the digital twin, to be able to collect data associated with geometries, even simple geometries, and keep on building on top of that. And then in many cases, we need to go all the way into the unit, like what was shown earlier with the clinic, to be able to zoom all the way into individual assets inside the space to make a decision which space is critical. This exam room is critical. Which asset is critical? This color-coded one here, which is an asset inside the space that has the need for electricity, which monitors vital signs. So a chair is not as critical as a vital sign monitor. So that's where Will's power packs come in. We're much more strategic in terms of let's get these pieces running. And all of this was the reason we were able to quickly generate this building plan without even knowing anything about the building, is because of our experience and our data and the background of what goes into a typical healthcare facility or an exam room. There are variations, but you can get within range very quickly without having the complete plan. Or the other scenario might be, well, we abandon this because there's too much damage here and we need to build another temporary facility with all of this capability. You would basically just grab all that and move it out, because it's all just on the web and graphically. Okay, so the scenario with the genset units from Trent, now we have, we changed the color code from in transit to deployed. That's why these are green. They're actually on site. This tent structure hasn't been deployed yet. This was in transit earlier, so we just basically say the operational status is deployed in Kharkiv, and then it turns green. All of this shifting of color coding and data starts opening up into reports and cost estimates and other ways to communicate with the teams. Any comments or questions on that from those online?
So this is Mike, and the section that we went to next after this was Art Kurland's participation in a previous BIMStorm where we had created some portable healthcare units for a COVID scenario that we had created.
Right.
And what we wanted to do
Go ahead.
was show how the ability to take previous work with listed assets and move it to a different location was possible.
Right. Yeah, this is from 2 years ago, actually. And the fact that it's, again, open standard based, we have these 20-foot containers called Pods with medical equipment inside it. And the scenario was that they're no longer needed at the University Health in San Antonio. And we're going to move them to Odessa, the port of Odessa, and then move them into Kharkiv. So the units actually are here in Kharkiv ready to be deployed. Basically, we're saying if they're a container, then we can put them on the ship, move them over there. How do we get them to Kharkiv? So it's kind of a worldwide scale, then zooming down to a very specific view like this. And also looking at the port in Kharkiv, which was an interesting scenario because John and his knowledge of port facilities and cranes and everything and how they bring in the same gensets that we were talking about earlier, the assets for generators, these ammonia generators, are used in scenarios where they put them directly attached to a crane if there's no power around there. Or if there's a substation, you can also attach it to a substation to power the whole area. So here's this scenario with the substation. The scenario with the crane is interesting because the crane actually uses power, but it also generates power when it lifts and lowers the containers. It actually generates power, so it needs storage. You can store the power and reuse it, I guess. So here we are in the port of Odessa with the pods that were delivered in containers from San Antonio, ready to be used in Ukraine. And we're also having other types of containers here with housing and offices and exam rooms. So all of these little blocks have detailed information inside them that you can start mobilizing on the port, deciding how much space do we need, and then actually moving them to the building. The buildings would not be here on the port. That was not part of the discussion. We don't want to build here on the port. The port facility is to bring in all the containers, and these would actually go in the city somewhere. And that's the beauty of this GIS interface, is that you can quickly see what's happening around and where is this needed. Okay, we need to have temporary healthcare facilities in this hospital here in Odessa. John also noticed that there was, if you use just the Google map itself, you can see that there's a grain silos here at the port. That could be another opportunity to support the grain silo and the food distribution based on just this minimal information that we have from the map. We also use Google Earth, and in Google Earth you can actually collect a lot of knowledge because there's you can see the number of floors that we saw in Kharkiv. You can zoom out and see the rest of the country, and then because it's a mapping tool, then you can start doing, well, the distribution system, which roads are available, how do you get there, where are the risks, where's the nearest port, where's the farmland that has the food sources. So there's a lot of really interesting things that can happen just with a mapping exercise like this, but then linking it to the digital twin of the buildings like we saw earlier, then you can zoom all the way into the details. One last thing here is
that's what Art was saying about the ability to manage the information about the assets that are in each of the containers. And that's what he implemented, the policy of sharing information from multiple departments using secure, open standards for information sharing. And that's a critical part of the asset management that can assist in the type of scenario we're describing here or in any organizational mission.
Right. So while we were doing all this live exercise and even duplicating and adding more containers here, this was the live assets in Kharkiv where we ended up. At the same time, we opened up the work order and preventive maintenance system. So you can actually get to this if you'd like to try it yourself. And the way that we used this during the exercise was that we started sending requests and even to ourselves, to everybody that was participating here. But if you do a pull down, for example, and you get to that hospital annex we were talking about, we actually have all the spaces here. This is the exam room, so you can actually say, okay, this exam room, the lights are out. And that is all, it's a zero training kind of a thing where we are using this with many community colleges to be able to send a request in. We'll be presenting this with the LA community colleges in a couple of weeks. And we used it here to submit a request, and that gets sent into another dashboard that we can all see what's going on. And it's tied directly to these buildings and containers here. So if we were to, on the fly, just create another container here that just arrived from port, we would have 3 ammonia generators instead of 2, and they would actually show up in here. What was really interesting to me from an asset management perspective is a lot of these kind of work order preventive maintenance systems, we typically focus on buildings and assets that are more or less stable, but even a completed building is constantly on the move. But this reinforces the fact that when you start getting into microgrids and containers, these assets are constantly on the move and constantly shifting. So the only way to keep track of that tempo is to have real-time data. The only way to collaborate across digital twins with multiple users is to have open systems. So it's absolutely not one system or one digital twin. It's an ecosystem of open standards that are talking to each other and scaling. And then it's also important that the end user is not burdened with the technology. So it's not you have to be a BIM or a CAD or a microgrid expert. You need to give that interface to the technician in the field to be able to see what's going on and interact with all the complexity that's happening in the background. So it was exciting to see this all come together with all the different participants pretty quickly.
And this is a good time to ask Michael Hardy from Bureau Veritas to comment on asset management ecosystem that you've been witnessing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. From an observer's point of view, really looking at how this workshop, say, maybe could be put into place in the real world, try to look at some of the sort of practical implications of it. So I thought about these, all of these ideas that came together, both from an asset leadership point of view, as well as an asset management point of view. I think Kimon's points about the digital twin is really, I think that starts especially with a kind of an asset leadership idea. There has to be a level of agreement, probably in advance, because we're talking here about sort of a disaster recovery type of exercise. So some idea that there's an acknowledgement that you don't want to have to respond to this kind of recovery effort with taking on a heavy sort of territorial view of like which software system is going to be used and how are we going to do it. You're taking this digital twin idea, which has to be scalable so that it can be used by any number of users. It's also needs to be resilient, so no single point of failure. And then I think the other thing that really stuck out to me was that it needs to be interoperable. This is the kind of thing that, you know, however it gets deployed in the situation, the idea here is open data standards, open APIs, and ways that existing organizations who are contributing what they can contribute to the effort are able to do it within their own operating parameters, their own systems that they use. And that is, as anybody probably listening knows, is that's a very tall order if there's not top level leadership saying, this is how this is going to happen. This is what we're planning for. And therefore, people have what they need in place. So digital twin, I always think of it as it's not a piece of software. Digital twin is really an architecture or a concept that I think has been talked about extremely well today, and really is pretty key to making all of this work. The other side of the coin, and it's too bad Art had to leave, but I think he talked a lot about the kind of the asset management practicalities of these things. So you get lots of people contributing to this effort, lots of people involved in, giving money, giving assets, providing resources. Asset management is what allows all of this to be tracked, accountable. You need to understand where things are going. We need to have some level of understanding that they're going where they're needed. And then these assets, say, being deployed in Ukraine for some period of time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, that may not be the end of the life cycle for that asset. And if we're thinking about this as a sustainable way to do, on a global scale, supporting reconstruction in lots of situations, how do you reuse that asset for the next, event where it's headed? So there's a lot of logistics involved in that. And I think one of the things that we all need to consider is that just like in every organization today, asset management as a practice does not happen in the other duties as assigned category. So people who have, already busy jobs don't just get the job of like, oh yeah, and don't forget to track everything and keep your data updated and do all that. So I think part of any, partnership response has probably also got to be, how do we consider the staff impact? It can't just be the people who are actually doing the responding or the rebuilding or manning the clinic. So what organization is going to be participating in actually managing, tracking, auditing the assets themselves? And then even something as simple, if you don't think about it ahead of time, becomes a real problem when that clinic pod, goes to its next station. Who was it that spent the time to make sure it's returned back to its proper condition, it's all working, all the supplies are there, all the assets are in place? And then my final point around all that is all this revolves around data too, digital twin, asset management systems, all those sort of things. But tying back to leadership, somebody has to decide, what do we want to track? What level of detail? What is appropriate? Because when just a truth to say you have to, you don't want to collect data that you don't want to manage. So you have to have this at the right level. The outcomes that you're trying to achieve, you back that up into what kind of data you're going to collect and manage, and then apply the proper resources and people to actually do that work so that this becomes a sustainable activity that could be deployed over and over again in multiple places
Michael.
in any situation.
Michael, thank you so much for those comments about the human factor, which Kimon has the ability to show ways of helping track that. And then also for making the distinction about the asset leadership and asset management and the repeatability of these processes. This is why we are doing these workshops, to have the documentation out there for owners to understand that this level of tool use, process, and mission outcome is even possible. So thank you for that. And Mark Giuliani, I just saw you nodding so much, so I want to let you have a chance to chime in on what Michael Hardy has said.
Well, I think Michael had some really valid points, and that is, and we run into this a lot, is that we, as architects, utilize building information modeling and go to great levels of detail to give all the information we think the owner needs. But a lot of times the owner just does not have the capacity to manage a level of detail, that's too high. So what happens is the data doesn't get updated as often as it should. And then over time, people stop trusting the data because they know it hasn't been updated. So you don't know what to trust and what not to trust. I think it's really important at early stages to kind of set the limits. We're going to do this level of detail. It's because that's what the owner can manage, and that's where our ROI is for the owner. And then if the owner can manage that data, then it'll be trusted throughout the lifetime of the facility.
And if I could just add to that, Mark, I think, what you're talking about is like day to day, right? That is every day, every organization, everybody that has a facility is dealing with that. Imagine sort of the stakes being so much higher in this scenario that we've painted. It would be catastrophic potentially for people not to trust that if they, bought into this concept, what if they received things and didn't know that it was working, complete, everything was there. It was actually meant to, it actually fulfilled the need, and that just became kind of a thing that people didn't trust because it goes back to they couldn't trust the data and nobody was properly managing it. So, right.
I mean, it's just that unfortunately, I mean, a lot of us want to be able to have a complete list of all the data of the building, but the models get too big. There's not enough resources to manage it. So you really are much better off establishing what the criteria is going to be, and the owner can then manage that data, and it's much more useful over the life of the project.
Yeah, actually, in my 30 years with BIM, we've seen this over and over again. But I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
owners, the owners really need to drive what they want to manage, because the knee-jerk reaction, as an architect, we love these detailed models which are needed for design and construction, but that's a different use than managing it for the life cycle. And it's like requiring somebody that's going to get into an Uber for a ride to understand how the engine is put together. I mean, they know the engine is running, but you need to go from point A to point B. There's a lot of misconception and actually, frankly, marketing pitches that say, well, you need a very detailed model to do anything realistic with it. Yeah, you do, but it has to be at the proper level of detail that you can maintain, because as soon as it's not maintained, as we all talked about, the data rots immediately. So that's the important piece of this. And the agility is also critical. And that's why this exercise is interesting, because there's no choice here. When you're moving this quickly, you can't sit there and say, well, 2 years later, we'll come back with a model that works or whatever. It needs to happen tomorrow.
Right.
And Will's approach and John's approach to these containers is exactly that. How do we quickly deploy and find out what's important to make this work?
And Kimon, thanks again for reiterating why we're doing this, is to demonstrate to owners what's possible. And I've been really happy, and I believe that you're going to be ending up working with Will and John going on in the future. But 1 second off that, Marty.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, what have you thought about the presentation? Marty is an ALN Senior Fellow, so I should have introduced you.
Yeah, so I thought the presentation was very good. I think it's interesting that we're able to help a nation that's in need. I did put in a question in the chat about the continuing danger of whatever we do there to be taken out in a single strike. So is it possible to have a backup plan for those kind of eventualities?
So I did answer that question and said that this is for reconstruction after the conflict is over.
Okay, that makes sense.
I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, the reason I brought that up is that we've got people here at the Parks Department who are designing parks for Ukraine, and I made a comment that maybe we should wait for the war to be over, but people didn't want to. So,
Marty, that's spectacular to learn. We definitely want to connect with those people. We want to show them this because it just so happened we chose healthcare.
okay,
This is needed for parks, and let's talk about that offline. But wow,
Sure.
It's incredible how this just outpouring of support for Ukraine is being supported by asset leadership.
yeah, good, thanks.
So it is for reconstruction, but it also, the modular units that we're showing can be moved. That's the beauty of them. If you have 6 containers and 2 of them go bad or something happens to them, you have the other 4 and you can put them on a truck and just move them. If that's the scenario. So I think it's for both, actually. It could work for both.
I think, to Marty's point, I think, yes, it could work for both. I think you'd have to take some precautions with large tanks of ammonia next to a hospital. I mean, we'd have to, they may end up getting buried just so they're not such a target. And whether it's ammonia for the green ammonia or diesel or whatever, any type of fuel storage tanks, you just have to take that into consideration and put them a good distance from the hospital so they don't become a bomb in and of themselves.
Yeah, good idea.
But the fact that it's scalable, the fact that these some of the things we saw today were basically, tents that could be shipped all over the world, and on top of the tents were solar panels. So it does make it something that can be set up very quickly in a disaster area and bring relief quickly.
Marty, what kind of energy requirements are there at parks, and how do you think those solar solutions that Will was pointing out could be useful in the asset management of parks?
Well, I think the main use is for lighting. I'm trying to think, parks are all different no matter where you go. I mean, we have a zoo in Manhattan, so that would be one use. But the typical park is playground with lighting, and there's really not much more electrical service other than that, restrooms, that kind of thing. So it'd be pretty low requirement.
But you would have the lighting in the restrooms. You might have heating in areas where it gets cold,
true.
so the pipes don't break.
That's true.
So there are some uses for it.
Yeah, good point.
And festivals, powering sound systems, etc.
Yeah. That's true. So periodically there's big use.
So,
I might
Kimon,
add, Mark, to your point, and also Mike, to your question for Marty, it seems like, the part of the power of the BIMStorm process is to get a bunch of people interacting in real time, ideally, who are experts who would be able to answer questions like, well, what sort of kind of energy needs specifically for parks, and what sort of security and safety concerns for fuel around a hospital. you know, I just love the concept of a BIMStorm, or maybe there's other ways to describe kind of this collaborative process that involves all relevant.
I think Nick froze.
Yeah. Need to heat him up.
Yep. It's all that snow in the background.
I thought I was the one having technical difficulties today. Well, sorry that we weren't able to get Nick's closing comments there. Kimon, but nobody else has any other closing comment, do you want to make a closing comment?
Yeah, the material that we presented today, it's going to be available online, and we're going to continue on in a couple of weeks at a conference in California with the Los Angeles Community College. I'm also presenting with the National Institute of Building Sciences about work that we're doing with the State Department. So there's a lot of connection points or similarities. The scenarios might sound different, but actually the approach is very similar from an asset management and data perspective. I find the formula to be exactly the same, and it's about this agility, open data, modularization, web APIs, not having one system control everything. That really is how you scale and make this complexity work.
That's the main points of the asset management and asset leadership perspective that we wanted to make here. Michael Hardy, thank you for pointing that out. Marty, thank you for joining us.
No problem.
Mark, thank you for your contributions. Nick, you cut out. Did you want to finish up what you were saying?
Yeah, sorry, you know, I've been here for almost 3 hours now, and that hasn't happened, but I seem to lose internet for a moment when I spoke. Unfortunate, I don't know quite where I cut out, but yeah, just talking about the power of this collaborative process to answer so many questions in such a short time, and, you know, at least hit on the big problems and kind of head them off before they, you know, before you get too far down in a design or a plan, to really, you know, do something quick.
Great. All right, so as Kimon mentioned, there are future activities related to BIMStorm and microgrids, and that'll be occurring in June. We'll provide information on that. And I just want to thank everyone one more time, and remind people that tomorrow we're going to be talking with Paul Schmodoloka at ALN Thursday at 3. He's the one who manufactures the grids that Will is donating, and he's got connections in Ukraine. And it's not going to be a typical asset management discussion, but I think it'll be very exciting. And thank you again to everyone who participated today: Kimon Onuma, John Arnott, Mark Giuliani, Will Heegaard, Art Kurland, and Michael Hardy. And thank you to the sponsors of this activity, which has been really exciting. Greatly appreciate the support and the support of our patron members and our organizational members. And thank you to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Bye for now.